Hello, everybody. It's Brian Hunt, and welcome to another episode of Risk On, Risk Off. As you know, this show is all dedicated about risk in all various facets and forms. We have a heavy concentration in construction and risk and real estate development, but as you know, we've had other guests talk about macroeconomic levels of risk and other things that could go bump in the middle of the night that go disturbing. You don't plan on it. And then so I was very, very excited to have this guest on my show today because I had the good fortune to listen to Bloomberg News one day with Tom Keene. And the author of this book was on talking about his book and immediately caught my attention because this is a topic that people in my industry have been talking about for years, as far as those involved with business continuity planning and business impact analysis to try to help clients identify and quantify what their worst case scenario is before the event occurs. And as we've kind of going to talk through this conversation today, companies are making the decisions really sort of based upon profits. And driving down costs and increasing margins, which is great. But what happens if you don't plan accordingly and something goes wrong and your supply chain snaps? And I think that's what we all learned the hard way during not only the Great Recession, but also the pandemic, that when you have global supply chains like that, things can get snapped and things can go horribly wrong. And so people basically didn't plan for it. And so when we talk to my clients until you don't wait for the event to occur to develop your plan. The whole point is to develop the plan ahead of time. And that's where the concept of enterprise risk management, supply chain risk really sort of evolves around. And so I was very, very fortunate to be able to reach out and get the following gentleman on the show to talk about his book. And so it's a distinct pleasure to bring on the show right now, Mr. Peter S. Goodman, correspondent for the New York Times for International Economics. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
No, this is great. Your book is phenomenal. I'm really looking forward to talking about this book, and it hits a lot of points that people in my industry try to explain. Like in the world of risk management, and you're trying to be, maybe sometimes you're the guy who's like crying wolf, is like something's going to happen wrong, but no, unfortunately, things do happen, and when people don't properly put any time or effort or resource into it, it can go sideways real quick. So, like to have you on, Peter. But before we really get into the book and your thought process, I just want to spend a little time talking about your background. And before we go further down the road, you're about my age. So if we're going to play a modified version of the game, we're in the world as Carmen Sandiego. We're in the world as Peter S. Goodman today. So where are you today, Peter?
I'm sitting in the mothership of the New York Times, 620 8th Avenue, nice. The middle of Manhattan.
So, Peter, we're talking, you're actually born and raised in New York, correct?
Yeah, I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, went west for college, then freelanced in Southeast Asia with a stop in Japan along the way. And over the years, I worked as a reporter in California, worked at the Anchorage Daily News for 3 years. That was my first real newspaper job. And then been fortunate enough to spend time in China for the Washington Post for 6 years and in London for 5 years for the Times.
So, Peter, when you were going off to college, did you know you wanted to be a reporter, or were you just sort of, or just interested in Asian international affairs? What was sort of your driving impetus for?
I've always been interested in journalism. I mean, literally going back to being 6 years old and gathering friends in a newsroom. In my sister's room and wandering around our neighborhood in Manhattan to notice that like something burned down. Let's draw pictures of the fire. And I actually would send out Rexographed copies. I'm really dating myself to throw that term in.
Wow.
To relatives and then invoice them. But no, in all seriousness, in college, I fell in with a bunch of activists. And then the big issue then was the divestment campaign against companies that were invested in South Africa. This is the anti-apartheid movement. And then quickly decided that the world seemed a little more complicated and nuanced to me than it did to my activist friends. And I was more interested in writing about issues and exploring issues than just simply agitating and taking a stand. And so after college, I went off and freelanced and have been at it ever since. But I do say not. In all candor, I didn't really sort of choose a career. I just kind of did what I loved doing after college, and then was fortunate enough to have that turn into a career.
And did you always have an interest in sort of the Asian studies or Asian cultures versus, say, the South, South America or Europe? Because you and I were chatting. You've come over the years to speak. You speak Mandarin, and so obviously it took some
Yeah.
effort.
Yeah, I took a trip to Japan, took a semester off from college, went to Japan and taught English, and lived in this house full of foreigners who had been backpacking around Southeast Asia and heard their adventures, and that just kind of got my interest. And then I spent an exchange semester in Fiji, of all places, in the University of the South Pacific, where there had actually been a coup right before I got there over this kind of post-colonial struggle where the Fijian constitution ensured that land could only be owned by native Fijians, but the indentured Indian labor brought in by the British to farm sugar had become the majority. And eventually an Indian guy got elected prime minister, and then the Fijians had to. And I just found this so fascinating. It got me into developmental economics and the implications of colonialism in the modern world. And so when I went back to college for my senior year, I went to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, where you have to write a thesis to graduate. I ended up doing a thesis on the role of the media in the Philippine Revolution of 1986, the People Power Revolution, for those old enough to remember that. So that was the one country that I ostensibly knew something about. I didn't speak any languages, and I knew I could make a go of in English in the Philippines. So after college, that's where I went to base myself.
Awesome. Well, Peter, actually, that makes kind of a good segue, because I want to get into the dynamics of the book, but let's maybe set the background, because you and I are both graduated from college. I think I was in '88. I think you were '89 from undergraduate.
Yeah, '89. Oh, because I took a year off. We must be exactly the same.
Yeah. And so obviously there was. I remember that time was the concept. Had the fall of the Iron Curtain. Eastern Europe started becomes liberated. They start maybe adapting, aspiring to Western values and economic developments. And then you also have the whole driving thing about China, the WTO, getting ingrained into the international economic system. Can you maybe set that time frame as far as you go back? Let's look at that dynamics that happened during that time frame, and how did that maybe set the germs, or not the germs, or the seeds to where we got today, as far as so much production leaving the United States and going all overseas for the purposes of lower cost margin.
Well, it's a really important question, especially given that now, in a moment of extraordinary political polarization, the one thing that everybody seems to agree on in Washington is that China's our enemy. We're supposed to have a containment strategy against China. I think it is important to remember how China became such an important center of global manufacturing, and it is part of the post Cold War story. You have this idea going all the way back to the end of the Second World War that trade is the ultimate source of peace in the world. I mean, Thomas Friedman, my colleague here at the Times, famously writes this book where he says, no two countries that have McDonald's have ever gone to war against one another. That's no longer true, by the way. But for whatever it's worth, there was this deep faith that trade would undermine nationalist impulses, that you would not be inclined to go pick up arms and fire them at your neighbor if you were trading with your neighbor. And that dovetails with financialization in the U.S. So the rise of the publicly traded company, I think it's fair to say in the 80s, really reaches a peak where the interests of shareholders are paramount. We have people like Milton Friedman telling us that so long as everybody's just pursuing their own economic self-interest, that's where true liberty and prosperity comes from. And then you have the interests of manufacturers and retailers to go make their stuff cheaply, buy their stuff cheaply, and they persuade successive presidential administrations, eventually Clinton, who comes into office having criticized George H.W. Bush for supposedly coddling the butchers of Beijing, This is after the Tiananmen massacre of 1989. He says the Bush administration has been guilty of not thinking about human rights. Things are going to be very different in his own administration. Well, when Clinton comes into office, he is lobbied heavily by retailers, including Walmart from his home state of Arkansas, to get China into the World Trade Organization, something China wants to do because reformists in China want access to global markets, and they also understand that if there's the force of an international treaty, that will give them a vehicle to do stuff that they actually want to do, but local governments are resisting, such as let state-owned enterprises fail, have profit and loss, really be a much greater driver of what plays out at the business level. But Clinton basically wants China into the WTO because it's the ultimate solution to every CEO trying to cut costs and grow their earnings. And he and the others, as part of this campaign, tell this story. It's not totally a fairy tale. It's not made up. I mean, other people believed this, but they kind of exaggerated that it wasn't about dollars. It wasn't about going to get, low cost tube socks. It was about bringing democracy to China. Well, we know how that story has played out. We did get the cheap tube socks, and now we get cheap furniture. We get cheap electronics. We have a very lopsided balance of trade, and democratization has actually worked in reverse. And with all of that money, the current government under Xi Jinping has built this incredible surveillance system. They've been very adversarial with neighbors. They're menacing Taiwan. The democracy part hasn't happened at all. But the part that has happened is we've come to depend upon Chinese factories to produce, just about everything.
Yeah. So we'll take a pause here, Peter. For those who are joining us, I am having a conversation with Peter S. Goodman. He is the author of How the World Ran Out of Everything. I've read this book. I think it's fantastic, and we're going to be exploring this in our conversation. If you wish to have a question submitted to Mr. Goodman, if you're watching this on LinkedIn, you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you should see a picture of me. Next to it should be an oval that says add a comment. Please type in your comment and press enter, and I'll bring it to, and as long as you keep it clean and PG, I'll bring it to Mr. Goodman's attention. So let's go back for a second on China. And Peter, I know I read your book, and obviously you can make an argument for both sides for everything. And I do, as we look back upon this, 20, 30 years ago, there's obviously no doubt that a lot of foreign capital and a lot of jobs left the United States looking for, lower cost unit production. Sure. And with that, though, and I've been to China, but I've never been to mainland China, but I've been to Hong Kong. But I take it you've been to more probably many times. But also, I think it's arguable to say that a lot of people were pulled out of poverty in China as a result of all this.
For sure.
Knowing it. So it is that sort of yes, manufacturing and jobs left here, and we can pull back on that second later, and then went to China, but as a result, the Chinese benefit by raising the standards of their people out of poverty. But then the flip side of that, but as far as what should have happened here, is we've gone higher up as far as comparative advantage. We're not going to worry about making broomsticks and furniture, but we're more going to be at the higher level technology of manufacturing and more advanced technology. But that requires an upgrade in skill and training that I think really wasn't pursued or implemented during that time.
Right. Yeah. My argument is that most of our trade related problems, the way we now talk about trade as if it's malevolent, as if we've gotten ripped off through globalization, it's really the result of stuff that we chose to do or not do in our own country. Now, look, I get it. I mean, if a bunch of trade economists are promising that everything's going to be fantastic if we integrate with China, Mexico, other lower wage countries, and the result of that is in your own community, you lose your job, and so do lots of your neighbors, and suddenly your downtown is degraded, and you don't see a future, you're going to be angry about that. I mean, anybody would be angry about that. That's legitimate, and that actually has happened. Correct. But why has that happened? Well, it's happened because in trade, there are always winners and there are losers. and we have completely abandoned the losers. So the winners are everywhere, right? It's like any of us who bought something on Amazon or walked into Target or Walmart or uh, bought a car, anytime in the last 25 years and needed a part for it. Like, we're all the winners, but that's very diffuse. And there are lots of costs that go along, some of which I make explicit in the book, that go along with the low price stuff. Whereas the people who've seen their lives destroyed, you can find those people easily. They're not diffuse. They're very concentrated. You can go to a town in Michigan where there used to be a factory that employed everybody at middle class wages, and now it's gone, and there's poverty and there's anger. But that's because we've utterly failed to deliver on the parts of our trade policy that were promised. Things like trade adjustment assistance, this federal program that's always been woefully underfunded, that's supposed to train people for productive careers if they're in the line of fire. In the Nordic countries, by the way, they do this very well. I mean, they're much more exposed to trade than we are, and yet they're not seething with anti-globalist fervor. There's an immigration backlash in places like Sweden, but they're not questioning the merits of allowing China into the World Trade Organization because they have national health care there. They have affordable housing programs. If you lose your job, you're not homeless. You can still send your kid to college. You can still go on vacation. I mean, these are really elements. When we talk about China, we're often pinning China with responsibility for decisions that we are making politically for ourselves in our own country.
I think it's a very astute point. So what was sort of the inspiration for you to think about when you're studying supply chains to come up with this book?
Yeah, I mean, this was an accidental book. I mean, I was finishing my previous book. It hadn't even come out yet, Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World, which is about how the surge of populism that we've seen around the globe is really a reflection of economic inequality. And I found myself starting to write about the shipping crisis and some of the product shortages. And then, it was very personal. I was living in London with my family during the first wave of the pandemic. And in April of 2020, our third child was born in the middle of lockdown. My wife was quite stoic about the fact that her parents couldn't fly over from New York to help with the baby, and she understood that we couldn't go see the pediatrician because the office was closed. But where she kind of lost it is we got home and she said, okay, well, we need to go get some hand sanitizer because this is, again, it's the first wave. We're worried about, the UPS guy could be spreading COVID for all we know. And I went out and tried to find hand sanitizer, couldn't find it anywhere, couldn't find it online. And then even ingredients to make hand sanitizer we couldn't find, and my wife looked at me and said, you're supposed to understand stuff. What's going on here? And I didn't really have a satisfying explanation, and in digging into it, that became this book.
So that I think is a great term. So let's maybe the first part of this chain that broke. Talk about, you did a really good job of this book because it comes down to financial numbers and guys from McKinsey and guys like, I'm a CPA too, so guys like me probably look at numbers. Just-in-time inventory, and specifically, what is just-in-time inventory supposed to do, and how did it sort of daisy chain as a result of the pandemic?
So just-in-time is a very sensible concept that's done very well. Toyota, end of the Second World War, is looking at their situation where the country's been devastated by the war, their capital's limited, it's Japan, so there isn't that much developable land, and they're studying Ford's great success. Ford is a real hero throughout Japanese business in that period. But they say, well, we can't do that. We can't just build these giant factories, have all this inventory on hand, make as many cars as possible, and figure out how to sell them later. We have to be much more efficient. We have to think about waste. And so they developed this system that they model on how a supermarket handles milk. They say, they conclude it's like, how much milk do you want in the supermarket? Well, you want enough that nobody leaves. No customer shows up trying to buy milk and they leave because you don't have any. But you don't want so much that you end up spilling some of it at the end of the day because it goes bad. You want it just in time as you need it. So they developed this system where they work with all their suppliers who are all clustered close to their original factories in the area of Nagoya, Japan. And they say, you're just going to bring us what we need on the assembly line as we need it in real time. Well, fast forward This turns Toyota into, by many measures, the world's most successful car company. Well, at the dawn of financialization that we were talking about in connection with how we end up sending so much stuff to China, consultancies like McKinsey, I pick on McKinsey in the book, but you really can talk about any consultant or any publicly traded company. They say, well, hey, CEO, here's the solution to your perpetual problem of how you make your share price go up. Just cut inventory, because Wall Street is looking for a return on asset. And that's just a simple division problem.
Mm-hmm.
How much revenue are you making in any given quarter divided by how much stuff you have on your books, asset, and inventory is part of asset. So if you empty out your warehouses of all these parts that you're holding as a hedge against trouble, you can liquidate and take the extra money and give it to yourself in the form of a bonus for being smart enough to hire McKinsey, give it to the shareholder in the form of dividends. The shareholder will love you. The stock price will go up. And everybody does this, and they do this so aggressively that every time there's a shock to the system, we start running out of stuff. I mean, the pandemic is the ultimate reveal, but it's the end of the story. It's not the beginning. I mean, the first supply chain disruption story I ever wrote was back in 1999 when there was an earthquake in Taiwan, and there were a bunch of computer chip shortages after that. Fukushima, the nuclear disaster, and the tsunami in Japan in 2011. Same story on a much bigger scale. We run out of all sorts of electronic components, and lots of people say we've overdone it with just in time. But we keep doing this because if you are running a publicly traded company, you may know that by going lean with your inventory, you are setting yourself up for trouble sometime down the road. But let's face it, the likelihood of a pandemic or some other disaster next quarter is always low. Whereas, if you add inventory and lower your return on asset, there's a good chance some activist investor will show up and say, how come you don't have as nice a return on asset as your competitor? You could be thrown out of your job. Yep. Whereas if you carry on with lean inventory, eventually there will be a shock. Yep. And it will be ugly. But with any luck, by then you'll have cast your stock options. You'll be lying in a hammock with a cocktail on some beautiful beach. And so, excuse me, just in time becomes this crude imperative to just slash inventory really irresponsibly and give the extra money to the investor class.
Peter, everything you just said there is really sort of spot on from our perspective. When I risk in life and risk and insurance, 20 years ago plus, back in the day, I used to do business impact analysis calculations, public accounting. Someone have a fire breaks out of their manufacturing facility and knocks out a line. Well, there's a property damage, but what comes as a result is the contingent time element or lost revenue or lost earnings that comes as a result of that. And so 20 years ago, I worked for my company at the time, FM Global, big commercial property carrier, started building this group within the guys I hired, me, or CPA finance guys to help their engineers, who are roughly, like we say, a bunch of engineers selling insurance. They were really starting to get some losses because they would see these properties have be knocked out, but then the contingent element, because what they made there fed into a product down the road that couldn't be made anywhere else. And as a result, the exposure was substantially bigger. And it ties into what you're saying because, and I think we're going to get to, as far as now the buzzword is resilience. It takes money to reduce the risk, but if you're incentivized to bump up your stock every quarter, then you're worried about short-term gain versus the long-term implications of resilience of your organization. And that's the trade-off.
I mean, telling an executive at a publicly traded company that they should spend more money and dilute their earnings next quarter to hedge against something that's probably not going to happen right now, but will eventually, is like telling your kid to brush their teeth. Like good luck. Like, you're right, they should brush their teeth, and if they don't, there will be consequences, but they're not listening to that. They don't want to do that right now.
So when you were doing your research and starting this book, what were the, say, industries that you were surprised were the most vulnerable as far as supply chain disruptions? If there was any
I was kind of shocked. I mean, that's a good question. So medical devices. I mean, I dug deep into the chip shortage, and I was shocked to learn that medical devices were like way in the back of the queue for computer chips, right? I mean, I was shocked to learn that auto companies, who were really responsible for the chip shortage, I mean, they're the first ones who said to the chip manufacturers, okay, this is a big economic downturn. People are losing their jobs. We're not going to sell as many cars. Please turn off your semiconductor lines, knowing that it takes months to get them going again and billions of dollars. And then they just assumed that when they needed the chips again, they could just, call up the fabricators and say, okay, we're ready for some now. And then they discover that actually they're way behind. Apple and Google, the auto manufacturers, are actually pretty small in terms of the grand scheme of things for semiconductors. Well, medical device manufacturers who are making things that are required to keep people alive, they're way, way behind. But I think the thing that shocked me most was learning the extent to which the kind of accounting level financialization dictated operational decision making. I'll give you a direct example right out of the book. Like I heard from an engineer at Union Pacific Railroad. This is, of course, a major Western railroad. This guy was based in Idaho, and he told me that he discovered that he was hauling containers, like hundreds of containers, to the wrong destinations. I said, well, why? Was that an accident? He said, no, because we've gone so just in time, or in railroads, it's called precision scheduled railroading, which is just a fancy way of saying just in time on the rails. They fired lots of maintenance people. They've consolidated trains. They're longer than ever, but there are fewer of them. And we've told Wall Street as a company that we're going to lower dwell time. That's the amount of time that a container sits in any given place. And Wall Street looks at that line on the spreadsheet, dwell time, and for them, that's a marker of how efficient we are. So that's translated down to the guy running our rail yard in Nebraska, who's decided that it's his job to just get rail cars out of there as quick as possible. Next train coming through, don't care where it's going, get all the cars, attach them to the train, get them out of here. I've done my job, dwell time's down. Never mind that you're taking auto parts that are supposed to be going to Southern California, and now they're going to Oregon. So now there's somebody who actually needs car parts in Southern California who's waiting. Never mind that there's drums of chemicals that are supposed to be going to some paint manufacturer in California headed to the state of Washington. Eventually, they're going to have to be rerouted back through Idaho, and down we go. And there are delays. So my takeaway from that is this kind of ruthless form of efficiency, as captured by these metrics, is incredibly inefficient. And that just blew my mind.
Yeah. I mean, and so to that point, I'm going to pull up. I've got my Kindle annotation. I'm going to pull up one of the lines here, which you and I were talking before, and just sort of blew me away. And if I can pull this up properly, and I'll share this for everybody out there. The line here that just really caught me when I read it: major electronic companies began covertly buying old toys and video game consoles, breaking apart ancient PlayStations and Barbie accessories to harvest the chips within. That just sort of blew my mind. So that was the
crazy.
What people were doing to scramble to get product out the door. That was just mind-boggling. Yeah. So to that point, you think about the pandemic, and I think you did a really nice job in the book. I'm sorry, you had that one individual. Had the
Hagen Walker.
Yes, the brand new contract with the Sesame Street toys, and so it starts from China, and so obviously he's got manufacturing in China, but then when this kind of walk us through like each stage of that process, how all the different vulnerabilities were popping up along the supply chain.
So Hagen Walker is a bright kid who graduated from Mississippi State University, stays in his hometown of Starkville, or rather his college town of Starkville, Mississippi. Mm-hmm. He's got this startup. He's making these little novelty light up plastic cubes. Like you drop them in a cocktail and they light up. The bartender can look down the bar and quickly figure out who needs a refill because the light went out. And then somebody writes to him and they say, our child has autism. Bath time is just hellish. Our child is overwhelmed by the sound of rushing water, and we dropped one of your cubes in, and he's transfixed. This is fixed. So this turns into a whole new business. These light up bath toys, and Hagen Walker's company Glow has just gotten this contract to make Elmo-themed bath toys for Sesame Street. The holiday season of 2021 is going to be their first delivery. First time they're going to produce enough to fill up a full 40-foot shipping container. They're making them in Ningbo, China. And it's early 2021, and they discover, first of all, they can't get enough plastic because the Chinese government has quite understandably prioritized plastic for the use of things like medical devices and ventilators. And then they are able to get plastic, but then there are worker shortages because China's still dealing with quarantine. Migrant workers go home for the Lunar New Year holiday. They don't come back. Well, eventually they get all this stuff made, and then it's time to get these cubes, these Elmo bath toys on a ship. And Hagen Walker's used to paying the equivalent of $2,500 to move a container of stuff from Ningbo, China. It's an East Coast city in China, to West Coast port like LA or Long Beach, and then by truck onto his warehouse in Mississippi. And he goes on Freightos, which is sort of like Expedia for businesses that are booking a shipping container. And he sees that prices are now 10 times as much.
Wow.
20, 25,000. And he's calling around frantically. I mean, this is Sesame Street. This is the biggest order in the history of his startup company. And brokers are saying, there's nothing even at these prices, we can't get a confirmation. You're making the booking, and then they call you back and they say, actually, there's no space. Even if you agree to pay these astronomical handling fees, they're being elbowed aside because, Amazon, Target, they're actually chartering entire container ships. Big companies like Columbia Sportswear are having to pay whatever it costs in the spot market to get a container. So Hagen Walker goes through several months of calling around frantically, eventually gets one, 28,000 into the port of LA Long Beach. The container ship arrives, and then there's one of these floating traffic jams that some of you guys may remember. There's more than 50 ships just stuck at anchor, waiting for weeks for a chance to pull up at the docks, in this case at the port of Long Beach, because there's so much traffic. There's so much physical stuff coming into the United States. Americans, we can't go out to eat because it's quarantine, but now we're outfitting our kitchens like restaurants. Our kids aren't going to school, but we still have to entertain our kids. We're buying trampolines. Can't go to the gym, so we're buying Pelotons. All this stuff's coming in, a lot of it from Asia, by container, and it just overwhelms the works. There aren't enough truck drivers. The rail system buckles. So my book essentially tells the story of how Hagen Walker has to really sweat to get that box to his warehouse in Mississippi in time for the holiday season of 2020.
Yeah, one part, and I think especially that story shows all the things that has to go right. And if only one thing goes wrong, can disrupt the entire process. But really, everything was going wrong. But the one thing I didn't realize that you brought up was the concept of the containers. Because like anything else, you're going to ship a container from China to the United States, you assume it's going to be full, and that's going to get money on it. But nothing was going back to China. So all these containers weren't going anywhere. They were stacking up. And so, you could go one way, but the almonds.
They were shipping the empties back.
Okay.
And the result of this was what Hagen went through was tough. What the exporters were going through was absolutely horrible on a whole different scale. I tell this story in the book, spent time with almond farmers in the Central Valley of California who couldn't get the usual empty containers. So usually what happens in normal times, shipping containers will come into a port like LA. They'll get unloaded. Okay, here's the shoes from Vietnam. Here's the electronics from China. All that stuff goes off to warehouses. Then they take some of the empties and they put them on trucks and trains up to the Central Valley. They load them up with almonds. Almonds, really important crop. 80% of the world's almonds are grown in California. Wow. Despite, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, California is still overwhelmingly an agricultural state, and the almond is the most important crop of all. And they load them up with almonds, and then they ship them out of the port of Oakland. And they send them off to Japan. That's a big market. They send them to Dubai, which is the hub of the Middle East. Well, in this period, the worst of the pandemic, because the shipping rates are up tenfold from China to the west coast of the United States, the shipping carriers were basically, an unregulated cartel. There's, three alliances, think like airline alliances. Even though there's dozens of actual carriers, there are really only three choices in terms of these alliances, like your Star Alliance, your One World, and they control like 95% of the traffic across the Pacific. Their attitude is, okay, if we can make 28,000 bucks to move a container full of factory goods from China to the west coast of the United States, we don't have time to send it empty up to these almond guys in Central California. We're going to take the empties and slap them right back on the ship in LA and get them back across the Pacific to China as quickly as possible to cash in on this bonanza. So, we're basically burning diesel fuel to move air across the Pacific.
That was the
That's
thing.
how lucrative it is.
Empty containers going back, but you had those almonds couldn't go anywhere, which it was just
right,
like a log jam. I was just fascinated with that. And so then obviously you have to get it off the containers at the docks, and that's a whole different issue with respects to those employees who work there. And you talk about the story as far as the unions and the contracts and how you kind of get your hierarchy to get the slots, and there's people who want to work there, but there's only so many people doing stuff you could during the dock, especially during the pandemic.
Well, yeah. So the dock workers are hugely important. They have the power to strike and bring the global economy to its knees. So they're some of the best paid blue collar workers on earth. And then at the same time, you've got the chassis pool. The chassis is the big contraption behind a tractor trailer on which the container sits. And there's a shortage of chassis, though. If you go to a port, as I did, you go to most ports, there are these giant parking lots full of chassis, and yet the so-called dray operators, these are the truck drivers who move containers from ports to warehouses, they're waiting sometimes for 12 hours to get a chassis. I remember I was with a guy in Southern California, and I said, well, these chassis over there. He said, oh, that's Amazon's pool. They have their own dedicated pool. So, this supply chain has really been optimized for big box retail, giant e-commerce, and everybody else is at the back of the line.
And so the next step was with the issue with respects to the long haul drivers in that whole industry. Could you talk about this? I was reading this book and I was like, oh my God, like the predatory financing, all these. Can you just maybe give a quick synopsis of what is the current state of long haul drivers?
The short version is don't go be a long haul truck driver if you've got another way to make a living. I actually rode in a tractor trailer in the middle of January. It was like 20 below zero from Kansas City across Kansas, Oklahoma, down to Dallas, where you are, Brian, and then to a warehouse right near DFW Airport. And then back to Kansas City. It was a 3-day trip. I slept in the back of the cab for 2 nights. And I saw up close. And by the way, I saw it, at its best because, I found a pretty good trucking company with a good reputation. Their turnover is only 100%. They only have to replace their drivers fully once a year, which actually makes them much more successful than, most trucking
That was mind-boggling when I saw that ratio. Like,
that's amazing.
Wow. Yeah.
But the industry is constantly arguing that there are these truck driver shortages. At a certain point, if something is always short, you have to ask, what are the working conditions and pay? And sure enough, driving a truck has been downgraded since deregulation. Actually, we often think of Reagan as the great deregulator. Carter, in terms of the supply chain, was a key figure. Carter deregulated trucking, and the result of that was, in some ways, too much competition. And it's a working poor job. You're on the road for months at a time. Sometimes it's very difficult on family life. The divorce rate seems to be very high. People are lonely. They're not healthy. It's hard to eat well. It's hard to exercise. And you're perpetually worried about caffeinating enough that you don't fall asleep at the wheel, but not so much that you always have to stop to go to the restroom. And you're obsessed with where you're going to park. It's hard to park a 53-foot loaded up tractor trailer and you're worried about parking somewhere that's unsafe, where you'd be robbed,
Mhm.
where you don't have enough services. So I saw this up close for 3 days, and it wasn't hard to understand why there's so much turnover.
So if you joined us late, we are talking to Peter S. Goodman. He is the international economics correspondent at the New York Times, and he is the author of How the World Ran Out of Everything, which I highly recommend.
Thank you.
And so if you have a question for Peter, please look at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. You've got a picture of me next to add a comment. Please type in your question. As long as you keep it clean, I'll bring it to Mr. Goodman's attention. So please don't be shy, guys. I know you're out there. So Peter, keep you respectful of your time. But so here we are now. And I think like anything else, there's a buzz term, oh, being resilient. But then I think in 6 quarters from now, people might be forgetting that. As you talk, as you travel the country, talk to industry leaders, talk to companies. Have you been seeing any evidence of firms or even companies or countries starting to think more holistic respects to their supply chain and their security?
Yeah, without question. I mean, just take Walmart, which is the biggest retailer of them all. I think it's fair to say that 15 years ago, if you flew down to Bentonville, if you were a retailer and you flew down to Bentonville, Arkansas, that's Walmart's headquarters,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to go see them. They don't come to see you. It's like going to see the Pope.
Yeah.
If you want your product on the shelf of a Walmart superstore, you would go down to Bentonville. They would say to you, "Where are you making your product?" And 15 years ago, if the answer was anything other than China, that was an admission that you couldn't possibly be getting the lowest price on your product. You couldn't possibly be making it at the most efficient scale. Well, now, if you go have that same conversation, where are you making your product? And the answer is only China, you have a problem. They want to know, well, what's your response to the shipping crisis? I mean, we now know the shipping carriers will jack up rates dramatically when they can. We know there can be shortages of containers. We're worried about climate change. We're worried about geopolitical conflicts, whether it's in the Middle East or Russia, Ukraine. We're worried about drought in the Panama Canal, which is limited traffic through there. We're worried about the Houthis opening fire on tankers headed through the Suez Canal, which is making containers go the long way around Africa instead of through the Suez Canal from Asia to Europe. They want to know, how are you going to shrink the distance between your customer and your factory? And so this isn't overwhelming, but it's happening in the margins. I mean, Walmart, to stick with that example, is moving some production from China to India. They're moving some production from China to Mexico. Other companies are doing similarly. Private companies are especially aggressive. I mean, I spent time with a medical device manufacturer recently, private one, MedSource Labs, based in Minnesota. I hung out with those guys in Colombia, where they've opened a factory and they've moved a bunch of lines from China to Colombia. So some of that's happening, but the appeal of the lowest price is still very much there, and it's still true what I said earlier, that if you're an executive of a publicly traded company, you may be doing the right thing to think about resilience, but if the net effect is you're diluting earnings in the next quarter, you may have a target on your back. So it's kind of a mixed bag.
Well, so Peter, what you just said there sort of tees up to my next question, which you just talked about today in the New York Times. So now you've got firms who have been thinking for the past, say, 6 months, years, whatever, couple months, years. Okay, we're going to bring it closer to the United States because we want to get away from China and have that disruption. So we're going to go to Canada. We're going to go to Mexico, maybe go to Colombia to get it nearshoring. But now comes the second version of the Trump administration, and he's pretty adamant, it seems like, I'm bringing tariffs to the table. So can you talk about how tariffs might be disrupting this whole process?
Yeah, tariffs are creating a lot of uncertainty. I mean, especially because of the way in which the Trump administration has ruled them out, right? So we got the announcement that we're going to have across the board 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Then we got a last minute stay for 30 days where we were told, because of the promises that the Mexican president made on fentanyl and similar promises made by the Canadian prime minister, they would be held up. But now, yesterday, President Trump says, no, actually now at the end of the 30 days, we're going to go ahead with tariffs. So it's very hard for companies to know. I mean, I did a story earlier this year in Monterrey, Mexico, and this is Nuevo Leon state. It's a border state. A lot of stuff is made there, comes through the Port of Laredo, and then gets trucked all over North America. And the sense at that point for factories there was that, Trump's bluffing. He doesn't want to stick tariffs on Mexico because the U.S. and Mexico are too integrated. There are too many auto plants in the United States that depend upon access to parts and materials that are made in Mexico, and it would make them uncompetitive to increase the prices. Therefore, we view ourselves, this is the Mexican factory owners talking, we view ourselves as the solution to Trump's problem. And Trump's real problem, as he sees it, is China. And we are the way in which he can help companies get out of China and make their stuff closer to customers in North America. Is that true? I don't know. Does the Trump administration know what its own policy is going to be? Maybe. Some people think that this confusion and uncertainty is part of the Trump administration's design. They want that uncertainty so they can reinforce the sense, like, you're worried about tariffs? Set up a factory in the United States. That's, the foolproof way to ensure that you won't be hit with tariffs. The problem is that everybody taps the global supply chain, just about. I mean, if you're making something that's sophisticated and that has any engineering to it at all, there's a good chance you're importing something. And I don't know, I was recently in Louisville, Kentucky, and I spent time with a manufacturer of pumps, sump pumps, other kinds of industrial pumps. It's a business that's been there for 86 years, has resisted, I think it's something like the third generation family control. They've resisted the temptation to move production to Mexico, to China, because they want to be in the community. They want to be an American company. Mm-hmm. And they have a factory that makes a component of their pump in Canada. And I'm talking to the CEO, and he says, listen, if we're the bad guys in this, then everybody's the bad guys. Like, why would American policy be directed, this is his perspective, at punishing me when I'm trying to stay here in Kentucky? So that brings home that even though the tariffs may be designed to encourage more production in the United States and a return of production to the United States, there are knock-on effects for companies that are already here.
So, Peter, be cognizant of time. I got one more serious question. I'm going to end with a couple of personal questions. So, the last question I got for you. When I was running around in the world doing risk management, and doing business impact analysis, trying to understand where the countries, identifying, quantifying where the company's exposure might be. The last question I always try to ask them is like, so if you stop and think about your operations and where could go wrong, what keeps you up at night? So, Peter, from your role as traveling the world from a global supply chain and economy, especially maybe a focus thinking about the United States, from what you know, what keeps you up at night? If you stop and think about, this happens again, or this happens, this is going to be a problem.
I really worry about the implications of this kind of Cold War that we're in with China now. I mean, it's very difficult to see how we can solve any of the world's problems if the two largest economies are now set on harming one another. I mean, how do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with issues of migration, of nuclear proliferation, of security? How do we deal with the next pandemic? If we have this level of distrust. So that's something that I would say keeps me up at night. But I also think that just domestically, our failure again to cushion the people who have been in harm's way in terms of the impacts of trade, in terms of the impacts of automation and robotics. We should be able to embrace automation and robotics. Like it's natural human inclination, right, to be creative and to figure out how to take the most dangerous and tedious tasks and give them to a machine to worry about. But how do we tell the guy on the line whose job is in harm's way, that this is a good thing if we don't have any of the programs in place to help cushion the blow. How do we tell the coal miner in West Virginia or Pennsylvania or Ohio that in terms of our response to climate change, you need to find something else to do, if that person can look around based on their lived experience and say, boy, if I lose my job, nobody's going to help me. We need to think about the people in the supply chain, or our supply chains are going to continue to be vulnerable.
Amen. So, Peter, when you're not running around the world writing for economics in the New York Times, what are you doing?
I'm hanging out with my kids. I got a 4-year-old, I got a 13-year-old, and a 12-year-old. Like to ski, like to hike, like to kayak. When it gets warm, I'll do some gardening. But yeah, I'm basically I'm on the road a lot for work. When I'm home, I'm kind of a homebody. But I also like basketball. I spend way too much time watching basketball and listening to NBA podcasts. Trying to figure out why the Mavericks traded Luka Doncic.
Yeah, that's the last topic we're going to talk about. For skiing, though, what's your spot? Where do you go ski?
Well, I love Europe. When we lived in London, we would ski all over the Alps, Austria, Italy. And honestly, living in New York, it might be cheaper to just fly back to Europe compared to these crazy lift tickets in the United States. But just came back from Park City, had a great time there. Went to Vail last year. Yeah, I'll ski anywhere. I love it.
No, I picked it up in the past 15 years. I didn't learn until I was like 40 or something. I kind of like later in life wanted to do. So I'm strictly just a green. And
good for you.
Blue guy, But I like.
Good for you.
Yeah, but I like Breckenridge. But yeah, your point, like those.
Breck's a nice place.
Yeah, but those lift tickets, if you don't have the Epic Pass, it's $250, sometimes $200 a day, depending on where you're going. And that's
monopoly power.
No, it's true. And but to your point though, I think there's some stories about it. Like, yeah, you got to pay for the international travel, but yeah, you could go to the Alps and it was like $25 a lift ticket or something like that. And it's just
more like 50. But yeah, I mean, the skiing is unbelievable. The food's great. Yeah. If you can handle the jet lag, it's a good deal and fun.
I'll have to check it out. All right, so you are a basketball guy. You're impartial. You live in New York City. Would you please try to help people understand, especially everybody here lives in Dallas, what the hell were the Mavericks doing trading Luka Doncic for Luka?
I don't understand it. We were batting this around before. Like, they must know something about Luka, but even if that's true, I don't understand. Okay, if you think you have inside information that says that this guy, who's clearly a world-class talent, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, is somehow a ticking time bomb or a cultural bomb or whatever, he's an asset. Like, call around. Like, cash him in for the multiple value. And it was they got a fraction of what that guy was worth. I'm open to a conspiracy to explain it.
That's really, even I hate to try to be one of the conspiracy guys, but that's like, it doesn't make any sense. I mean,
doesn't make any sense.
From an economic standpoint, you supply and demand and value, it does not make any sense to get.
There's some gray matter there to reckon with. Yeah.
No, amen. Peter, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation. Like I said, if you have not got his book, you need to go get a copy of How the World Ran Out of Everything. It's a fantastic analysis of the global supply chain and how all the things that could go wrong did go wrong, and how we're still sort of paying for the cost of it. So, Peter, what's the next book? You have that lined up yet?
I don't. Yeah, okay. I wrote 2 books back to back with no leave and a newborn in there, and I moved from London back to New York, so I'm trying to catch my breath. Yeah, don't have a good answer.
All right, Peter, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Brian. I really enjoyed it.
Appreciate it. So that's been another conversation here on Risk on Risk Off, where we try to bring in experts on risk and risk management, enterprise risk management. And quite honestly, if you are remotely involved in any sort of production, manufacturing, and quite honestly, in construction, real estate, it's so much different. You are susceptible to supply chain disruptions, and it behooves you to spend a little time thinking about the worst case scenario, so that if you were to see a disruption to your supply chain, how are you going to be able to work around that, mitigate that? Again, I've been a massive fan of this book. I highly recommend it. So please do yourself a favor, get a copy of Mr. Goodman's book, and you're going to be a better person for it. Until next time, guys.